where you offer a very interesting thesis that the two decades, the decades of the 80s and 90s, that sealed the victory for neoliberalism, pulled the center-left parties to what you call the extreme center. This means the most liberal democracies were reduced to a essentially one-party business system with two organs, albeit that duel in every 4 or 5 years. A change in government, just as in case the Brown Blair government in UK, meant little change of policies with regards to austerity, regressive taxation, privatization of transportation infrastructure, banking, with rising cost of health, education, and housing, all amidst the sea of unemployment. So the thesis basically is the center-left parties drawn to the center, and it is incapable of giving lead to the struggles from below based on these issues. And your book goes beyond Britain, although primarily Britain, but it discusses the European Union. Now, the same book, you rightly mentioned the hopes about the Bolivarian sort of experiment, the very anti IMF protests or in Venezuela, or the anti-privatization of water in Bolivia, and anti-privatization of electricity in Peru, and so on. They have, however, crystallized into bigger movements and organized political parties, and they have come to power. So explain for us this sort of why has it happened? Why has Europe failed to do what the Bolivarian leaders have managed to do in Latin America?
Two reasons. One is that the consensus established in European and North American politics throughout the 80s and 90s, culminating with the collapse of the Soviet Union, meant that they were no longer worried or scared by any groups on the left. For them, the danger about many of these groups, the big mass parties of the Communist Party in Italy and the Communist Party in France, was that the Soviet Union was there behind the scenes to help or not to help, but it was there. And its presence made them nervous. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, and that whole world changed, the results of which we're seeing today in the Ukraine. But once that world collapsed, they had no reason to carry on making any serious concessions to the working class movements in Europe and North America. So if you look at what happened, it's quite stupendous, really. The two largest communist parties in Europe, working class parties, representing, not exclusively, but largely, the majority of the working class in France and in Italy, collapsed. Slowly in the case of France, and dramatically in the case of Italy. I mean, the funeral of the last popular Italian communist leader, Enrico Berlinguer, the inventor of Eurocommunism, the funeral had almost 1 million people on it. But the people who were speaking, of course, they were leaders of the trade unions and the PCI Communist Party leaders, but present were the president of Italy, the Christian Democratic leaders, everyone. So it was as if in his death, as in his life, they were embracing him. And the Italian Communist Party basically lost its grip on working class politics because it was moving consistently to the right. The French party's trajectory was a bit different, but not so different. So the collapse of these two parties in the center of Western Europe created a huge vacuum. And into this vacuum came neoliberalism, the new methods in which capitalism was going to be deployed, and right-wing or nationalist parties took the place of the communist parties. So the picture is a combination of economics, sharp change in the ideology of the consensus that had governed the capitalist world in the West till the 90s, no, till the 80s, and a total collapse, I would say, of the political culture of the left. Of course, there are small groups, tiny groups and individuals who carry on. But by and large, the culture of the left received a huge blow in Italy and in France. I don't want to exaggerate, because in France in particular, there's still research institutes, etc., who produce useful stuff. Even though the emphasis is on empirical data, nonetheless, this empirical data lends itself to conceptualization, and not necessarily by the writers, Piketty, for instance, but by others. So this big shift marked a new consensus, which made social democracy in Europe seem redundant when it came to power. I mean, Britain is a good example from that point of view, because it's an example being followed slowly, different ways elsewhere in Europe. What was this? It was that effectively Thatcher developed such close ties and links with the United States on every level that there was no difference left. It affected British politics, economics, culture, military adventures abroad, everything. And this was carried on by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, the two Labour prime ministers who followed her, and very openly. They didn't attempt to deny it. They said, we will even go further than her. So that Blairite moment in Europe, other social democrat leaders said, look, Blair's turned to the right, but he's won, and we can repeat this experience. Well, they never could properly repeat it, because the Blair experience itself was taken from Thatcher. She was the one who broke the consensus in Britain, and Blair and Brown carried on, and that's the consensus which is still the ruling consensus, which is why they acted so brutally in destroying and getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn and expelling many, many left-wing members, etc., and just even as we speak. So effectively, a question arose, if you like, let's put it a bit abstractly. How could capitalist rule be most usefully extended and protected, since the big enemies had gone? The small enemies were there, of course, trade unions, but by and large, trade unions tend to fight for economic issues. That is as true now as it's been in this country, in Britain, for a very long time, and in the United States. Just to put in a footnote at this level, that I think what Blair and Brown and Thatcher, but more Blair than Thatcher, wanted to do, and to a certain extent succeeded in doing, is Americanizing British politics. So the country they admired the most was Britain, to such a trivial extent that they started renaming things like the UK border. You never used to see that when you came in, but they started doing it on that level, just mimicking, renaming the Court of Appeal the Supreme Court, etc. And politically and culturally, I mean, if we talk in terms of culture, the British cinema by and large doesn't exist. Either it's funded by Hollywood, Or in the case of some radical film directors like Ken Loach, he can't make a movie in Britain where he lives without a lot of support from Europe, where he is almost worshipped as one of our greatest living filmmakers, not in Britain. So in this situation, they decided, what do we need? Too many, politically diverse parties. There is general agreement between the Social Democrats and the Conservatives. The liberal press and the right-wing press don't differ that much on basics. Often over the last 10 years, very partisan pieces in the New York Times were not as crude as Fox News, but basically there was no huge difference. So that is the extreme center. 21st century wars, where the United States can't get its way, they fight. And when the Russians start behaving in the same way, everyone is shocked. And people say, but yes, the Russians. I say, no, the Russians are mimicking the United States. They see the United States can get away with wars and murder and crimes everywhere they intervene, backed by the Western world. So the Russians are saying, well, if they behave like that, we can behave like that, since given that there's nothing progressive about the Putin regime at all, in my opinion. It's a conservative regime, which prior to this was, getting on pretty well with European capital. The oligarchs were embedded in every part, in every major country in Europe and in the United States. So that is where we are now, that political diversity is either crushed, as in the case of Bernie Sanders in the States, or in the more radical case of Jeremy Corbyn, not only is it crushed, but he is effectively suspended as a Labour Member of Parliament. And lots of people supporting Palestine are accused of being anti-Semites and kicked out of the Labour Party. And they don't see any contradiction in the fact that they have this Starmer apparatus has expelled more Jews than ever left the Labour Party. They are expelling all the Jews who are critical of Israel or critical of Zionism and are not Zionists. They're being expelled. So it's a very unpleasant situation intellectually in Britain, where you have the most right-wing conservative government we've seen since Margaret Thatcher, and since they destroyed Corbyn, and the people left behind in the Labour Party have been told by Starmer in private that we'll not let you stand in new seats, in your own seats, if you sort of become too obstreperous. So they were forced to dissociate themselves from a document that criticized Putin, but also NATO, because the criticism of NATO was impermissible for the Labour Party. And that's what I mean, that effectively democracy is being hollowed out. And they don't care what you say about it. They don't care because they feel they're in command, and nothing can really touch them or damage them in their own countries. So we will see what happens. I mean, the situation now is that the French situation is, as you know, pretty dreadful, with Macron, excuse me, with Macron back in power, behaving in the same extreme center way, and the French who went and voted for him to avoid getting the fascist or semi-fascist Le Pen don't know what to do, because Le Pen is now cozying up to Macron and vice versa as to how to keep the left at bay. So all these people who said rather Macron than Le Pen are completely bewildered. At least in France, the left exists to some extent. In Defiant France, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon and others like it. But in Italy, there's nothing. In Britain, the tiny left that exists in the Labour Party are total prisoners of Starmer. The Stop the War movement, which is very large in Britain, is still there. I wouldn't say that any group today in most of Europe offers either a real challenge or a real alternative. I mean, the German left party is in crisis between those who would like to make their peace with the system and those who still want to fight back. And of course, one big test for this party, which the German bourgeois parties always said was key, was whether they accepted German membership of NATO. Now, it's not that they could ever defeat that, pull Germany out of NATO. The left party couldn't do that. But the fact that they refused till recently to even consider the possibility meant that the Germans were nervous that there was, a large percentage, 10, 15% of people in Germany who were hostile to NATO. And now the party is divided on this issue and debating that. Let's not even talk about Eastern Europe. I mean, these countries moved happily from being satellite states of the Soviet Union to becoming satellite states of the United States of America.
What about the Syriza opponent in Greece and Podemos in Spain? I mean,
Syriza proved to be a total disaster under the government of Alexei Tsipras. He committed political suicide when he called for a referendum and appealed to the Greek people to vote no to the terms being imposed on Greece by the Troika on behalf of the EU. And when the Greek people voted no, he was the big mood in Athens whenever I visited. He went back within 48 hours and rang up all the EU leaders, said, don't worry, we're going to ignore the referendum. And it took people some time to understand what was going on, that the Tsipras decision to ignore the results of the referendum, I think, was the biggest slap in the face of European democracy that we have seen over the last few decades. Just straightforward. It's happened, we are not going to do it, let's carry on. Naturally, the demoralization started, and we all knew, it wasn't a big secret, that sooner or later this government would fall and would be replaced by a conservative government. And that's exactly what happened. So Tsipras moved to the extreme center on many, many issues. They used to have a good position on Palestine, made friends with Israel, told the European Union that they would be loyal members of the EU, failed to fight for the interests of the Greek people. And Varoufakis tells a lot of interesting stories about this. Now, you also asked about Latin America and South America. That's very, different. The origins of democracy in South America are very different. This was regarded by the United States as its backyard. During the first Cold War, the United States, wherever it became necessary, kept military dictatorships in power. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, etc. Some of the major countries. Gradually, democracy was permitted but controlled. And then came neoliberalism, or the new way in which capitalism decided to function. And that brought about a wave of movements from below. So what you had in Venezuela, in Bolivia, under Korea, in Ecuador, to a certain extent under Lula in Brazil, was a swift turnaround on foreign policy. They would not let their countries remain dominated by the State Department or the Pentagon, but also a modest reform proposal, which was instituted. So I characterize this at the time as social democracy based, left social democracy or radical social democracy based on mass movements. That is what gave them the strength to get where they did. And they've suffered blows, we shouldn't deny it, and they've made mistakes, but they're still there. The victory of the left in Colombia, which is the country where the US has bases, where the military is run by a bunch of fascist thugs, let's call people by their real names. In this country, finally, people have said enough is enough and elected a left-wing president and a startlingly eloquent and brilliant vice president, a black woman. This is Colombia today. So the pink tide is not gone out. It's not receded forever. It goes out and then it comes back in again. And they have not been able to bring it under control. And their ways of bringing these things under control are either direct coup d'etats, they attempted two in Venezuela, both of them failed, or then they moved on to getting the opposition to carry out acts of real provocation and recognizing an opposition leader, Juan Guaido, who no one, even the opposition in Venezuela, can't stand him because he's such a crude imbecile. And he looks a bit like Obama, so they thought just by using media images, they'd get away with it. And all their stooges in the Western, in the European Union followed suit. I mean, just withdrew recognition from a government and recognized an imaginary president. So this is the way in which democracy is unfolding internally and externally in the case of most of these countries. But certainly in terms of continents, South America has been the most stimulating. Let us go no further than